Stephen King's writing has had a hell of a lot of adaptations over the years. I mean, just look at the list on Wikipedia. A lot of them are really good, but with quantity like that, quality is almost inevitably gonna vary. For every Shining, It, or Carrie, there's a Shining, It, or Carrie. But one novel of his that can't seem to catch a break is Firestarter. Released in 1980, the book has been adapted 3 times at this point, as a film in 1984, a follow-up TV miniseries in 2002, and the topic of today's video, another movie released in 2022, serving as a remake. And none of them have been particularly well received. Reviews for the first movie and miniseries were mixed at best, but this new version has been ranked as the worst of the bunch. Now, full disclosure, this is the only version of Firestarter that I've looked at, so I can't speak for the quality of the book or other media, but at the very least, when it comes to the reception that this movie got, yeah, I can see where people are coming from. The plot follows a family consisting of Andy and Vicky McGee and their 11-year-old daughter Charlie, who each possess their own set of superpowers. Andy has telepathy, mind control, Vicky has telekinesis, and Charlie has developed pyrokinesis. Unbeknownst to Charlie, this is because Andy and Vicky were test subjects in a science experiment run by an organization called the DSI. Andy and Vicky escaped and have spent years on the run with Charlie, who's just confused at why she can't live a normal life. But Charlie's powers are now getting more and more difficult to control, leading to the DSI finding the McGees, forcing Andy and Charlie to go on the run, with Charlie needing to learn to control her powers, and the two doing whatever's necessary to survive. So right from the movie's first conversation, you start to notice the film's main issue. And I'm not just talking about how badly dubbed over this line from Zac Efron is.
Now you like pancakes?
The characters just feel so flat and underdeveloped. Every scene feels like the characters are just trying to progress the plot above everything else, but in terms of showing some actual personality, characterization, chemistry, etc., it feels like the movie is just doing the absolute bare minimum, and they constantly seem so distant from each other despite them supposedly being a loving family. We only really get to hear the characters talk about their problems, but we barely get to see them actually experiencing them or get any insight into how they feel about them. One of the main sources of drama is the struggle that Charlie goes through trying to keep from getting emotionally overwhelmed and losing control of her powers. But the movie makes very little attempt to show why this is difficult for her. She's shown to be frustrated by the fact that her parents don't allow basic necessities like Wi-Fi in order to stay off the grid, but we hardly get any look into how that affects her life and why it frustrates her. She apparently gets bullied a lot at school for it, but that isn't explored either beyond a little bit of snickering from the class, 4 or 5 lines of dialogue,
Nice work, Goober,
and getting hit by a dodgeball one time. And that's apparently enough to make her quite literally blow up with anger. This is supposed to be the final straw that makes her lose control, but the bullying itself is just glanced over and there's almost no deeper look into how she feels about it. I'll give the movie this. The way that these early scenes hint that the family is on the run is actually handled kind of well. We get some subtle clues that they're trying to stay off the grid, such as Andy not accepting credit card payments at his business, or Charlie clearly parroting an excuse her parents told her about why she can't use the internet.
Too much screen time can cause health problems in children like insomnia.
I think a little screen time would be just fine. Help with your grades too.
It is a good way of building intrigue early on in the film about the situation these characters are in, but when the characters in the movie aren't all that interesting, it kind of makes it harder to get invested in that type of thing. And the movie's villains are even more so underdeveloped. It's honestly kind of baffling. First of all, the way they're introduced in the plot makes 0 sense. After Charlie eventually loses control and causes an explosion in school, this results in the DSI finding the family through an infrared satellite video picking it up. Why does them seeing this footage of an explosion immediately make them realize that the family is involved? There's no indication of what caused it, and there's a huge number of potential, not to mention more likely, explanations of what could have happened.
She's been less than forthcoming about how she did it, what she used to cause the explosion.
And their actual plans don't make a whole lot of sense either. The main villain is the DSI's leader, Captain Jane Hollister, who wants to capture Charlie in order to study her. But it's never established what she actually plans to accomplish by doing this. She says that she doesn't want to turn her into a weapon and that she wants to help her and others like her, but what does that entail? We never see much of the inner workings of the DSI or even an explanation of what they are or do. The movie never even says what DSI stands for. How do you make the main threat of your movie this unestablished? Andy does mention that the DSI will lock Charlie up and run experiments on her for the rest of her life and take her away from her parents, but we never actually see any verification of that. Andy even flat out says,
Who knows what's gonna happen to her?
exactly, we don't know. Andy, as far as we know, is just speculating. The movie never bothers to establish what the main characters are running from, which makes the whole conflict feel vague. There's also a secondary villain going by the name Rainbird. He was another test subject that the DSI experimented on, and he's acting as a superpowered mercenary for them, hunting down the family and trying to capture them. And he's honestly one of the most nothing characters I've ever seen play a major role in a work of fiction. He's not written with any kind of personality, and he has little to no established motives. He's depicted as being extremely aggressive and willing to kill anyone that gets in his way, but there's no reason in his characterization for why he pledges such allegiance to the DSI to the point where he's willing to go as far as he does. He's basically just a violent plank of wood.
How could you work for them? Help them after what they did to you?
The movie's themes feel really half-baked too. The ways they're presented do seem potentially interesting, but there's little to no exploration of any of it. We get to see a little bit of Andy's morals being challenged and how he's willing to put the needs of his family above the interests of other people. Some examples being a flashback to him killing some DSI agents who try to capture Charlie as a baby, and another scene where he mind controls a guy named Irv to give them a ride despite him being in a hurry to get home to his disabled wife. But the movie never explores the consequences of his actions. Those DSI agents are just nameless extras whose only role in the movie is to die, and the only attempt the movie makes to explore the ethics of it is Andy mentioning that they quote-unquote probably had wives and kids.
They probably had wives, kids that they loved.
I mean, sure, that's a possibility, and even if it's not the case, I can understand him feeling guilty. But A, there's no exploration of how this affects Andy psychologically or emotionally, and B, if you want me to get invested in the deaths of fictional characters, you need to give me more to emotionally attach to than just, oh look, these guys died, isn't that sad just in and of itself? And Irv and his wife just flat out don't suffer any repercussions from Irv giving them a ride. In fact, I don't think him being late even gets mentioned after he agrees to drive them, making it just kind of a non-issue. There's also the matter of Charlie learning to control her powers, which again could be interesting, but we don't get to see much in the way of progression. There's a few scenes in the first half of the movie where she either struggles to keep her pyrokinesis contained due to being emotionally overwhelmed, and a couple scenes where she lashes out, hurting others in the process. But it barely comes up for most of the movie, and she learns to exercise self-discipline way too quickly in a short montage during the last third where she doesn't even struggle that much. I feel like it should have been a slower progression over the course of the whole movie. You know, give her some of that character development stuff that the kids are into. Speaking of Charlie's powers, Andy makes a big deal about how she needs to learn to control them so that nobody gets hurt. You'd think he'd be sticking as close to her as possible to avoid any incidents, but there are times where he just kind of leaves her on her own, not really considering that something might happen. For example, at one point in the movie, she gets scratched by a cat and, without thinking, burns it almost to death. Then, later when arriving on Irv's farm, she asks,
Would it be okay if I played with your chickens?
and Andy just leaves her to it. Yeah, that's fine, I'll just leave my daughter alone with a small animal. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? It's not like she recently burned a cat to a fucking crisp.
Try not to cook any of them.
Now I'm gonna get into spoilers, and even though I don't recommend watching this movie, it's still a relatively new release, so if you're interested in seeing it and want to avoid spoilers, skip to the time on screen.
We have to get somewhere safe.
So at this point in the movie, Andy's been captured by the DSI while Charlie has managed to escape. Now that she's learned to control her powers, she's headed to the facility where Andy is being held. She ends up confronting Captain Hollister, who tries to reason with her to let them study her, only for Andy to convince her to burn down the entire operation. And this climax just feels meaningless for a number of reasons. It mainly comes back to the problems I talked about earlier. There's barely an explanation of what the DSI as an organization even is or what they plan to do with Charlie, so she doesn't have much incentive to turn herself over to them. There's no compelling decision that Charlie has to make because the movie doesn't bother to properly establish what her options even are. The only other way the movie tries to make this choice interesting is the fact that the DSI is holding Andy hostage to try and coerce Charlie to turn herself over and also stop her from burning the place down with her father inside. Meanwhile, Andy is willing to sacrifice himself to save Charlie's life. The problem is that Charlie doesn't even make the choice herself. Andy ends up mind controlling her to burn the place down, which robs the scene of any complex decision making that Charlie might have had to make that would have been much more interesting.
I'm sorry to make you do this. Burn it all down.
The Climax also tries to give Rainbird a redemption arc, where he turns against the DSI by killing agents as they've got Charlie cornered, thereby saving her. But the movie does practically nothing to show what's caused him to have this sudden change of heart. The fact that he wants to help her and feels remorse for what he's done comes completely out of nowhere. I, honest to God, cannot fathom how these filmmakers just seemingly forgot to include this many crucial details about the villains, from their goals to their motivations to Rainbird's entire character arc. Oh, and there's also the fact that the movie unironically tries to make the line "liar, liar, pants on fire" sound threatening, which goes about as well as you'd expect.
No, please. Liar, liar, pants on fire.
So yeah, if you couldn't tell, this movie didn't do anything for me. I should clarify, the fact that I had almost nothing nice to say might make it seem like the movie is the worst thing imaginable, but it's honestly not. It's just a poor film where almost everything about it is flat and unremarkable. There's very little good about the movie, but there's nothing excruciating either. Still, while I can't say from experience whether or not the book or even the other adaptations are any better, I have to imagine they're probably at least marginally more interesting than First Draft the movie over here. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video more than I enjoyed this movie, then make sure to subscribe and click that bell to get notified for when I upload next. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.